Good morning, race fans, and welcome back to another edition of Research Fantasy Presents our NASCAR DFS picks for DraftKings for the Quaker State 400 being held at Kentucky today. This is a fun track. Interesting notes. I think it's been repaved the last 2 years. Last year's repave caused a whole lot of issues. I believe at least 10 to 12 cars didn't finish the race, not just on the lead lap, but didn't even have, I think 2:16 sounds like the number I believe I saw when looking through past results. Turn 3 is especially bad. In practice in 2016, you actually saw like Kurt Busch got into the wall, or he spun out. In the race, there was a lot of guys who couldn't keep grip taking the turn. It didn't seem that bad, so perhaps this year's repave kind of negated some of the severe damage at that track that was being done in terms of how cars were running. But if you watched practice or qualifying, you do see that this is one of those tracks that does give the drivers what I like to call the wiggles, where you'll just watch them and suddenly they'll just start to wiggle. I mean, that's pretty common, but it seems a little bit more severe on this track. This is also a track that last year you could not go 3 wide on. We saw Brian Blaney and I believe Chase Elliott get into each other trying to do that. We saw Clint Bowyer get into Danica, but I don't think it affected anyone other than Bowyer. It didn't cause an accident. It just caused Bowyer to spin his tires. So why do I say that? Okay, so like we have to realize that in NASCAR, you cannot predict accidents. You can look at Talladega, you could look at Daytona, and you could pretty convincingly say, in reality, half this field is going to be eliminated by the end. So it's really stressful to try to find a combination. Like, in full disclosure, this past Daytona, I had 0 lineups bring 6 of 6 through. At Talladega, I believe I had 4 of 20 lineups. And at the first Daytona, I had 19 of 20 lineups. And that was the first week I played NASCAR, so I was very excited. So it shows, number one, that I was probably better off when I started out. I didn't have as much thought into things as I do now. But I'm just saying, this is one of those sneaky tracks where you could see a quarter or a little bit more of the field eliminated. Now, why am I saying this for the second time before I got sidetracked? Is because we're getting to the point now where some of these drivers need to get wins in order to make it into the playoffs. And I think that my gut says that the need to win is going to cause guys like potentially Kyle Busch, Joey Logano, Eric Jones to take a little more risk on the track, which puts us in a position where we've got this really big risk-reward scenario. And like, Kyle Busch has led a lot. He's won stages. He's finished high enough that in terms of points, he's fine. But there could be a chance if we don't see duplicate winners from here on out. If Jamie McMurray wins, if Matt Kenseth wins, I don't know if he's already won. I don't think he has. I know Ryan Newman has. If, there's a situation that exists where you could see guys like Busch and Logano pushed so far out that there's no way that they can get into the playoffs. So I think you will see a little more aggressive driving, and it's a little riskier here than I think on some of the other 1.5 mile intermediate tracks. Qualifying was certainly interesting. They only made it through 2 rounds of qualifying, and the speed record was broken, I believe. I'm trying to count. I think 8 times. Chase Elliott broke it first, and then Harvick, Blaney, Hamlin, McMurray, Kenseth, Truex, Busch all set new records for best time. in qualifying on this track. So cars are moving fast. It was cold. I would definitely, I don't want to say pay attention to the weather, but a cold track is a faster track, which I think would mean an increase in accidents, because the faster you go, if that wiggle happens, the less you're going to be able to control. Like, it makes sense that if you're going 190 miles an hour, you're probably going to have less control over your vehicle than you are at 50 miles an hour. Not that that's what they'd be going on a slow track. I'm just trying to illustrate that one wiggle could cause a tremendous amount of damage. So let's actually get into qualifying, and I'm just going to pick out a few plays that I really like. First of all, Kyle Larson, I think, is going to be just about the biggest lock on this slate. I would expect... So people aren't going to just lock Kyle Larson in. I think that's one thing that needs to be stated here, is I think in the industry, some of the talk I've seen is that in tournaments, people think he's going to be owned 80-some plus. Cash games, he's probably going to be 90 to 95% owned. We've seen this before where guys like Johnson, Boyer, Larson, Harvick all start in the back, and the ownership gets high, but it gets like 40-50% high. And I could be off here. One thing that I will admit that I don't have as great of a feel on is how ownership is going to go, but I think it's going to be a position where if you play Kyle Larson in 55% of your lineups or 60% of the lineups, you may have an advantage over the field, because I think that it's probably going to float in that 50-ish% range. Of course, I could be wrong. We could see him at 80% owned. My projections, which I have a lot of work to do on, this is the first week we're testing them, but my projections have him finishing around the 17th position. At that, you're getting a good amount of fastest laps, because he's going to move up through traffic and get some fastest laps, and you're getting 23 points of place differential. So I believe my projections called for him to have in the early 50s, maybe somewhere between 52 and 55 as a final score. But the whole point with Larson here is that he's got the capability. Overall, in terms of averaging fastest practice, he was number one overall, right ahead of Martin Truex, but just barely. So he's got a car that he could take from back to front. We've seen Jimmy Johnson do it once already this year. Kyle Larson is fully capable of going worst to first and putting up a 100-plus point weekend if he's able to do that within the first stage and comes out and leads laps. Ahead of him, I do think that there's merit to playing some of these guys from, let's say, like Landon Castle to Gray Gaulding. I think the difficulty is figuring out which one, and is it really going to be worth it? So if you're of the opinion that there's going to be several people with strong Dominator potential, so if you believe that Larson obviously has a huge potential for Dominator points, and you've got Busch, Truex, Keselowski, Harvick, Johnson, all of guys who carry a very big salary, there's nothing saying that Gray Gaulding can't finish in 28th in this race. That's an 11-position jump. That might not be a ton of total points for him. I want to say that probably still floats him around like 30 to 32 fantasy points. But if those guys I mentioned, if some combination of those higher-priced guys do manage to kind of go off and have 80-plus fantasy points each because they've split, Larson gets a place differential, Busch and Truex split, and have 100 laps led each, and we're seeing 80 and 90 fantasy point weekends, then a guy like Gray Gaulding could be very beneficial. Not really feeling anybody from Joey Gase to Matt DiBenedetto. I think that those guys are all in a really tough position there. You're looking at probably late 20s, I think, as being a good turnout for them, a good result for them, and I just don't see that being enough fantasy points to justify it. Then we have Ryan Newman. Ryan Newman is one of my favorite plays, starting at 29th/40th. So typically when you see a guy have to change an engine in practice, there's no real motivation knowing that he's going to go to the back to qualify, because if you qualify high and you go to the back, you're just putting yourself in a position where you've worn a set of tires, or you've done something that kind of prohibits you from taking advantage of a bad situation. I believe it was either Newman or Kenseth who had this happen at Sonoma, and they turned a very positive result, even though they had poor track history, because they didn't try to qualify at all. They were able to save a set of tires in that process. So Newman's going to start 40th. He's going to start with -11 fantasy points, which inevitably is not something you want to have in a driver. But this is a guy, again, who's got top 15 potential at this track, turns up in that area much more frequently than you would probably think. Yes, this is a huge disaster waiting to happen if he happens to start in the back and can't get up and gets in an accident or something like that. But really, it's like in season-long fantasy sports. If you don't want to take Gronk over DeAndre Hopkins because you're afraid of Gronk getting injured, you can't predict injuries. Like, you just can't predict wrecks. You just can't predict, oh, I know Ryan Newman, he's going to get in an accident this week. Like, that's not that simple for that to happen. So, even though he's starting with such a large negative score, he should be able to, get back into the 30th position within a couple of laps here. I see no reason not to use him. I'm kind of hoping that people stay away from him this week, because at 29, I believe he's got better upside than the guys behind him and the guys immediately ahead of him. One guy I do like is David Reagan, 26th. And again, we're like sitting here and saying, David Reagan, okay, at 36, Nick, I get it, but at 26, there's just not that much room for upside. I disagree. Good track history here. Definitely see him as a car who can get into the top 20 if things really spiral out of control. Let's just say drivers like Patrick, Stenhouse, Boyer, Jones, Earnhardt, Elliott wreck out, and it's not guys like Gray Gaulding, Reed Sorensen, Joey Gase, BJ McLeod. Let's say some of the upper echelon drivers crash out. All of a sudden, now David Reagan has top 15 capabilities. He's priced like guys like Landon Castle, and I just think that there's a much better upside for David Reagan than it appears. I like him more than guys like Austin Dillon, Paul Menard, Casey Kane, Chris Buescher. If Michael McDowell was a little bit lower on this list, he'd be right there for me. Now, kind of 19 up is where I like a lot of guys. I'll just let's see, I'm already running 13 minutes, but I'll keep it going. I like to do these breakdowns here. Bain has excellent course history here. Take that for what you will. He's starting 19th. He's averaged like 12th place finish. That's a fair amount of place differential points. I don't mind using him. Stenhouse, not the greatest mile and a half racer, but let's just call it what it is. He's been extraordinary this year. Like, he's got more wins than Kyle Busch. Basically, he's got more wins than half the field, more than half the field. He's got 2 wins. The only guy ahead of him is Jimmy Johnson with 3. I think it's a mistake to play without some Ricky Stenhouse. I don't think he can win this race. I do think he can finish top 10, and it seems silly to discount a guy starting 18th just because we want him on bigger tracks like Talladega, Pocono, things like that. I'm fine with him. Darrell Wallace, I think, has some upside. Bowyer upside. Love Kurt Busch. This smells like top 5 all day. He finishes top 5 with a 10-spot place differential. You're set. That's going to return excellent results for you. Jones just scares the hell out of me, if we're being quite honest. I can't trust him. Earnhardt, I'll have a small exposure, but he scares the hell out of me. Elliott, interesting here. Logano, interesting here. Brad Keselowski dominates here. 10th, starting 10th. Short of an accident, I just don't see that there's any way he doesn't finish in the top 3. He's just owned this track. I think that he's a solid play in just about every format. Then we got Daniel Suarez. Again, starting 19th. I love him. Starting 9th. I want to have a small amount of exposure because I'm convinced he's going to come out of nowhere and ding one of these things eventually. And, you kind of want to be on him when he does that. But with other guys in better positions, I just think it's, I'm going to keep my ownership very low. Jimmy Johnson, Kevin Harvick, definitely 2 guys who could take the win here. Have to have some exposures. Ryan Blaney, 100% absolutely want to have exposure to. Running a fast car, has a win, so he's in. But he's young and he wants to fight for more. Hamlin, these JGR cars running real nice this weekend. Don't write him off. He's got the potential to take this down. Then you have Jamie McMurray and Matt Kenseth. They're interesting. McMurray's showing a ton of speed in practice. Kenseth has excellent results here. I just cannot be a buyer, really. Basically, for Jamie McMurray to be worth it, he has to finish where he starts. And that's a tough ask. When I'm looking at 10 guys who I see being able to finish before him, but he's been solid, maintaining top 10s, not a bad driver. Kenseth's kind of the same deal. Excellent course history here, but where's the upside? He's starting 3rd. Can he hold 3rd? Can he head to 1st? Yes, these are all possibilities. I'm not going to not have exposure to these guys, but it isn't going to be a high amount of exposure. I have to look for guys who provide more upside that I think have the potential to lead laps. And with Kyle Busch and Martin Truex Jr. at 1 and 2, you'd have to understand why you're a little bit hesitant to look at guys like Kenseth and McMurray when these 2 could very well and very easily dominate the laps led. Both of these guys have led a lot of laps this year. Kyle Busch has led a ton of laps in Kentucky. This was literally a best-case scenario for him. When we were watching qualifying, I looked to my wife after round 2 and just said, please, let this rain happen so that the rest of qualifying is canceled and Kyle Busch starts from 1. It's not that I wouldn't have taken him past 1, but it's just that I feel like you're going to get a significant amount of laps led from him. And guess what? This guy is great on the restarts because he's aggressive and he's got a fast car. So even in the situation where he gets caught in cautions late in the race and he's at 3rd or 4th, he could turn that 3rd or 4th into 1st in a matter of half a lap based on how he races. And you're allowed to dip down the yellow line here where you haven't been able to do that with Daytona last week. So it's going to be interesting. If I had to pull 4 guys out of this and say these are guys, and I'm going to kind of differentiate it from my article a little bit. Who am I building around? I'm building around Kyle Larson. I'm building around, and this is tournament, Ryan Newman, David Reagan, and Brad Keselowski. I think all of those guys have strong place differential potential, and that's where you want to go for that. In terms of laps led, it's Kyle Busch, Martin Truex Jr., Brad Keselowski, and I'm going to actually go with Kevin Harvick here too. He's shown the ability to kind of handle this Kentucky track. So clearly, I think my favorite out of the bunch is probably Brad Keselowski, just because where he's starting at 10th, you're already starting with like 30-some fantasy points. If he gets to 1st, now you're over 40. If he's leading laps, now you're 70 points and beyond. And I think you'll probably have 2 guys who do that at least. Depending on what happens with Larson, it could be 3. Getting the right 3 in your lineups combined this week are going to be very important. Hope this has helped you somewhat. Don't hesitate to leave comments, ask questions. I will be somewhat unavailable today. I have a bunch of things to do for the website, but I'll try my best to check back here. Thanks for watching. Make sure to check us out at researchfantasy.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Make sure to like the video because I love seeing that. I love when I see people actually appreciating the work that we try to do here. Make sure to like us on Facebook at Research Fantasy. Follow us on Twitter at Research and Win. And join us again next week.